Good morning. I'd like to call the meeting to order. The first item of business on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from the July 13, 2017 meeting. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? The motion carries. The next item on the agenda is the report of the chair. So good morning and welcome to the July 27, 2017 public meeting of the New York City Campaign Finance Board. Next week, the board will make the first public funds payment in the 2017 elections. For participating candidates who qualify, contributions from New York City residents are matched at a 6-to-1 rate. The match applies to the first $175, so each city resident's contribution could be worth a maximum of $1,050 in public funds. The public matching funds encourage candidates to raise small dollar contributions in their neighborhoods. This limits the influence of large contributions from special interests and ensures that candidates better understand and address the diverse interests and needs of everyday New Yorkers. In order to receive public matching funds, candidates must meet a fundraising threshold to show that they have public support and follow the rules of the program. This includes attending at least one training session. CFB staff have held training sessions for candidates and campaign staff regularly since 2014. And Monday, August 7th, will be the last day for candidates to attend these mandatory training sessions for the 2017 election cycle. At this time, I will turn to CFB Executive Director Amy Lopres for her report.
Thank you very much. On July 17th, we received Disclosure Statement 9 from candidates in the 2017 election. 228 candidates filed that disclosure statement. That also marked the launch of our beautiful new Follow the Money search, which is a easy-to-use and visually appealing new way to look for campaign finance disclosure, and it fully integrates the independent expenditure disclosure that we receive from those entities. Including a feature that allows the public to search independent expenditures by image. So if you receive a document in the mail and you want to know about who sent you that document, you can look for that image on our website. I want to thank all of the people who were involved in creating this, everyone in public relations, special compliance, and systems who worked very hard to make this wonderful new feature. The next deadline for candidates to submit financial disclosure reports to the Campaign Finance Board is August 11th, covering all activity from July 12th through August 7th. And the candidates may begin submitting their statements as early as August 8th.
All right. We have two candidates appearing. Thank you. We have two candidates appearing today, and I'll call the name of the first is Joseph Hayan, and would Mr. Hayan and/or his representative please take a seat at this table, and the staff of the CFB at that table.
So just a brief explanation of what's going to go on. The staff will explain the issues before the board. You'll get an opportunity to make any arguments that you want. The board may ask questions of you or the staff. The board will go in after we have the other candidate appearances. The board will go into deliberations, and then they will return to vote on the penalties for all the campaigns that are before them today. You can either wait, or one of our staff members will call you with their results.
Okay.
Good morning, Chair Schaefer, Executive Director Loprest, members of the board. My name is Cameron Ferrante. I'm Associate Counsel for the CFB. With me today is Sonia Kubica-Chamois, a CFB auditor. Before the board is the matter of the Joseph Hayan campaign in the 2013 primary election for City Council District 44. The candidate was a participant in the program and received $23,100 in public funds. CFB staff recommends that the board find that the campaign committed the following 7 violations of the Act and board rules, and assess penalties according to the 2013 penalty guidelines, failing to report transactions, failing to demonstrate compliance with reporting requirements for disbursements, filing a late disclosure statement, accepting contributions from corporations, failing to document a transaction, failing to demonstrate that spending was in furtherance of the campaign, and failing to respond to the initial documentation request, and filing a late response to the draft audit report. CFB staff further recommends that the board find that the campaign must repay public funds. The campaign contests these recommended violations, penalties, and public funds repayment.
All right.
Thank you.
Now to you, please introduce yourselves and say whatever you'd like to say.
Okay, my name is Abe Schwartz. I was the campaign treasurer. I'm not representing Hayon at all. In fact, he's been totally uncooperative with me for the longest period of time. And that's why I did resign at some point from the board. I just want to...
Mr. Schwartz, could you just speak more directly into the
Okay.
microphone? We're having a little more closer to you.
Okay. Should I start from the beginning or should I...
Okay.
I'm not, I've never been in this type of situation, so I hope you'll forgive me if I say something or whatever. Anyway, basically, I'm a CPA in private practice. I'm involved in doing pro bono work for various type of organizations. At some point, a group of people came to me and asked me if I would be campaign treasurer of this campaign, of Hayon's campaign. I didn't know much about it, but I went to a couple of the sessions here, the seminars. But basically, all right. So I started out with Hayon, and I put in place whatever accounting guidelines I needed to put into place and try to work with him. At some point towards the end of the campaign, I realized that I wasn't getting any cooperation from him. I should have at that point sent him my resignation. I didn't send it in till later than that. I want to go over a couple of these particular violations. It doesn't have to be in any order. The last one, number 7, do you have it on... No, I'm looking. I want to talk about number 7.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Around the time when I resigned, during the time when I wasn't even involved in the campaign, apparently I received. Now again, I don't remember this. Requesting information about it. I asked the candidate to please take care of it, not even knowing whether I had any obligation to do it or not to do it. Obviously, nothing happened. Must be about a year later when somebody contacted me from Campaign Finance, Catherine Loving, and I began working with her. I was just saying overhead that, unfortunately, she's not. She's in a different department, but she would tell you that I worked with her on a continuous basis, on a very regular basis, from the day that I was told that I'm obligated to provide any of the information. There are dozens and I think do you have any of those emails? There are dozens and dozens of emails between me and her. She helped me along. I responded one time to it, and the penalty was reduced from that $20,000 down to like $9,000 now. And I responded to this, and we're talking about each time like 150 pages. Everything was done in a correct way. At no point did I not respond. If we're talking about the initial document request, I was not even aware that I have to respond to this because I'd already given in a letter of resignation to the state. But as soon as they called me, I would do it. So I am pleased asking. We were talking about this penalty, and I think that you could speak to the attorney over here or to the other attorneys. You'll see that I was fully cooperative with it, and first thing that I would ask would be on that penalty could be removed. That would be the first thing. The next item that I want to talk about is number 4. No?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Number 4 relates to something, accepting contributions from a corporation. This relates to the fact that there were some advertisement bills that related to the campaign that were not paid. So they were listed on one of the statements, and on the final statement, they were not listed. The reason that they were not listed in the final statement is I, as an accountant, know if there's no money in an account and there's no way of getting paid, I have no reason to list it as an outstanding liability. If I would have known that I have to list it, I would list it. And the other thing that I want to specifically state about that, a number of those advertisement bills, there were checks issued. I'm not sure whether the campaign even had a record of it, but they do have the bank statement, and the bank statement will show that I wrote out checks to pay these invoices. But during that time, the candidate was also writing checks. He had signatures already on the account, and he was writing checks. And as a result of that, these checks bounced. So the checks, a number of the checks from these advertisement bills were paid by me. I have it on the bank statement of the month of November, where they were paid. I don't know if you saw that. You saw there were some bounced checks. I don't know if it's is it appropriate for me to talk. I don't know. I mean, you just tell me what you know.
I did see evidence of at least one check that was returned for insufficient funds. I can't tell you for which it was. I do understand that I have no evidence of any of the vendors listed on as a corporate contribution as having been paid. With a check that cleared or with a check that was returned.
All right.
Any agreement with any of those vendors that they would not be paid?
No. And there would have been no reason not to pay them. Nobody's doing, no advertising and no newspaper is doing favors to a candidate and giving him free ads. And I have, for example, over here, just though on one of the ads, in fact, this was sent in. It says pay check number 1113, and that's what's sent. And if I'm looking at the bank statement, this is just one example. I'm looking at the bank statement. It says check 113 returned, and there's a fee, a $34 fee for return check. So all of these, some of these, we're talking about 5 advertisement bills. Some of them were paid. I paid them, and the checks bounced. Some of the others, there was no money to pay. And I've tried contacting, and Mr. Israel over here, who's been helping me out in this process, tried contacting them. That we have emails asking them to give us a letter that these checks were not paid, and they owe the money. But of course, nobody wants to talk to you. They're angry to begin with that they weren't paid. These were not contributions by corporations, and these are only the advertisements. I mean, to say that 5 advertisement checks that I wrote and tried to pay, and some of them I actually wrote checks and I wanted to pay them, and for the campaign finance board to say that these were contributions by these corporations, it's incorrect and it's unfair.
Okay.
I'd like to ask a question of the CFB staff on this issue. What evidence would you normally require that an unpaid bill was still a liability?
The evidence that we have is that we generally examine the campaign's financial statements, their checking account statements, to see if the money has left the account. We generally ask as proof of payment that we have the front and back of the cancel check, demonstrating that it was endorsed by the vendor.
I'm
I'm
asking
sorry.
a case where it's not paid. Put aside for a moment, and I understand it's an important piece of evidence, but put aside that their report did not include this as a liability. Initially it did,
Sure.
and then it got deleted. Just put that to a side for a
course.
moment. So you see that there's services rendered by a company, and you're wondering, okay, was this a contribution, or was this just a liability that wasn't paid? Ordinarily, what would you ask of the campaign to show that this is still an outstanding liability that they simply had been unable to pay?
I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
Yeah.
We generally ask the campaign to provide us with a letter from the vendor stating that they are still waiting to get paid, that this is still an outstanding liability.
And if the vendor is unwilling to provide that letter, is that conclusive in your view that it has now been transformed into a contribution?
I would say no. If the vendor's unwilling to reply, generally we just ask for proof of outreach on behalf of the campaign. In this case, Mr. Schwartz hasn't provided us with the emails he references, so we had no proof that the campaign had actually conducted any outreach to the vendors to obtain letters indicating that there were still outstanding liabilities.
And we also, in addition, so it could be something contemporaneous, like right now. But if we had a piece of documentation so that any of these vendors had sent a past due notice, would be sufficient. That they had affirmed, because often vendors who want their money send additional notices asking for the money.
Would you like to address
Yes,
this
go
point?
ahead.
And can you identify yourself, please?
My name is Chaim Israel.
And your
Chaim
role-
Israel.
And your role is?
I'm just helping out. I was one of the supporters of the campaign. I was very disappointed, needless to say, but I'm helping out Mr. Schwartz, who's a pal of mine from our days together in yeshiva, and I tried to gather some of the documents that were required for submission. I myself did reach out to some of the vendors that I was familiar with. I'm not familiar with all of them, and we did ask for a letter, and they have not responded. But I do have at least one email, two emails to one of the vendors or two of the vendors, I'm not certain, asking them for a letter stating that the amount is still unpaid, and they have never responded.
So you sent a couple emails, let's say two, and there was no response. And Mr. Schwartz, you referenced some emails a little while ago. Could you remind me what those emails were about? You also efforts to get a letter, or were they something else?
Yes, it's on?
It's on.
Okay. Yeah, I also attempted to get, because obviously it was a large penalty, and I even told them that, the Campaign Finance Board is assessing penalties for it, but they're not responding. Again, I also have two of the vendors over here that checks were actually written out to and bounced. The checks bounced. It could very well be, I was the treasurer, but the relationship that they had was with the candidate, and I've had almost no contact with him. I tried here and there to get some contact with him for a short period of time. For about 2 months, he was working in the same building as me, so when I saw him, I would ask him questions. But as you see, he's not even here, and he doesn't really care one way or another way. He says, I have no money anyway. So, it puts me just in a very bad position.
Can I ask you just a question? So, Mr. Israel, you referred to that you reached out to two vendors. Just so there are 4 vendors at issue. So, if you could just say which ones you reached, so that we just have a clear record.
There were 2 Yiddish newspapers that I reached out to.
So, Der Yid and Der Blatt.
Right.
Okay. I'm assuming from the list that I have in
Yiddish,
front of me.
right.
Yes.
I did reach out to both of them.
Okay.
I have email that I actually tried to follow up with Der Blatt, but I did not get any response.
Mr. Schwartz, do you recall who you reached out to?
Well, there's one in here that I don't even know who it is, and I'm not even sure that if you can check to see if there's an invoice for it. ONP, order and print. I'm not even sure that that really existed. I think that that was just that Mr. Ayon had called the office and stated that we should list that one as an outstanding bill invoice. Never received, as far as I know. I have looked through all my records and haven't received an invoice, and I don't even know where to contact them, and I don't even know who they are. This was for $1,100. I have no clue who it is.
So there's no contract and
No, there isn't even. There isn't.
you have
Wasn't
no
even.
idea what work, if any, was performed.
No. As far as I know, he had called my office. Somebody in my office that was entering the information, because as I said, I run an accounting firm, and stated that there's an invoice for order and print for $1,100, and we should list it on the statement, because it was like pretty chaotic, towards the end. I don't think of an invoice, and I don't think she has an invoice, because I have copies of everything that I sent out, and it was that one was left off because it never, as far as I know, it never existed. I can't swear to it, but I just never saw an invoice even for that one. So we're talking about $1,100 for the order and print, which I know nothing about. The two of them, the Blatt and the Yid, which are another. The Yid is $1,800. The Blatt is $750, which encompasses $3,600 out of the $3,850 of invoices, and of which two of them we actually wrote out checks, and the checks bounced.
When was Disclosure 16 filed?
It's January of
Yeah,
January 15th, 2014. And maybe
When did you resign as treasurer?
Around that time.
Here.
Probably right. I probably filed the disclosure. I'm sorry.
Their first contact regarding resignation was on January 27th. The resignation with the State Board of Election was effective January 30th, 2014.
Were you involved in preparing disclosure statements 15 and 16?
Yes.
If I may clarify just on what I said earlier about the documentation of the outstanding liabilities, the campaign didn't provide any actual copies of the emails that they're saying they have, but they did, in their response, indicate that the vendors were uncooperative. They just didn't provide any actual documentation of that.
Got it.
So we have it on the record. Would you discuss the obligation of a campaign treasurer after resignation with respect to responding to document requests and draft audit reports?
Well, in this instance, the initial documentation request actually went out in December of 2013, December 24th, I believe. The campaign opened the IDR on January 27th, which was the same day that it contacted the CFB regarding the treasurer's resignation. And the treasurer's resignation obviously wasn't effective until 3 days after that. So one could argue that the treasurer would be responsible for responding to that portion of the document request, the IDR, since it came out while he was still acting as treasurer. In terms of
how long does one have to respond?
In this instance, I believe they had, how long do you have to an IDR?
For the initial document request?
I'm not sure on the due date, but generally they would have had additional time. I believe they were contacted on slightly before the 27th to remind them that they hadn't opened the documentation request because it had been about a month.
So again, I'm not drawing any legal conclusions from this, but the facts of it are that the request went out while Mr. Schwartz had not yet resigned, or at least it wasn't effective, but the documents were due probably after his resignation was effective.
Likely, yes. I can't speak directly to the due date of the IDR.
And the draft audit report?
Was issued after his resignation.
Mr. Schwartz, can you just describe, you said that you had attempted to contact the candidate, but that he was uncooperative. Can you describe that?
What point of time are we talking about? Are we talking about from...
Actually, one of the first sentences you spoke when you sat down, you said that you'd been trying to reach the candidate and that he had been uncooperative?
Well, once campaign finance contacted me and told me that I'm required to respond to this Catholic Loving, when she contacted me, and this was going on. In other words, I went ahead. Anything that I prepared, let's say the first response that I had, and this current response was all done on my own. He wasn't cooperative. He really wasn't cooperative in November when I realized at that point that I have to resign. But everything takes time in the process. I'm working on a full-time position, and things just get lost sometimes on it. But throughout the whole period of time, I've had almost no contact with him. I tried calling him, he wouldn't respond. I've sent him emails, he doesn't respond. I mean, the candidate is not here. You would think that somebody that has some sort of obligation would show up. His obligation is not this $9,000; it's another $20,000 or whatever it is. You would think a candidate would show up. He just doesn't. He basically left me hanging.
Got it. If I may, Chair Schaefer, I just consulted the documents. The response to the initial documentation request was due on January 23rd, 2014, so slightly before the resignation. But again, the campaign doesn't appear to have opened the document until January 27th.
Anything further from any of the members? Do you all have anything further to add?
Aside from pleading that
we got that. I'd also like to note that in my many years of practice, I've never had a representative describe himself as a pal before, but it is a status that I'm prepared to recognize. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much for preparing.
Thank you.
All right, the next candidate who is appearing, I believe, is Mercedes Narcisse. Is that person or representative here? Very good. Please have a seat. And CFB staff on this matter, please take a seat at the table. So you've observed what went on, so the CFB staff will go first, make a short presentation, and then we'll hear from you. Thank you very much. Go ahead and proceed. It's okay, take your time.
Good morning again, Chair Schaefer, members of the board. Cameron Ferrante, Associate Counsel for the CFB. With me is Malaysia Mingo, CFB Auditor. And before the board is the matter of the Mercedes Narcisse campaign for the 2013 primary election for City Council District 46. The candidate was a participant in the program but did not receive public funds. CFB staff recommends that the board find the campaign committed the following violations of the Act and board rules and assess penalties according to the 2013 penalty guidelines. Failing to report a merchant account used for campaign purposes, failing to provide bank statements, failing to report transactions, failing to demonstrate compliance with cash receipts reporting and documentation requirements, failing to demonstrate compliance with reporting requirements for disbursements, filing late disclosure statement, accepting over-the-limit contributions, accepting an in-kind contribution from a corporation, accepting contributions from an unregistered political committees, failing to document basic campaign functions, failing to document transactions, failing to demonstrate compliance with intermediary reporting and documentation requirements, failing to demonstrate that spending was in furtherance of the campaign, and failing to respond to the initial documentation request and an audit request. CFB staff further recommends that the board find that the campaign is entitled to receive a post-election public funds payment and that the payment be applied against any penalties assessed by the board. The campaign contests the recommended violations, penalties, and public funds payment amount. Thank you.
First, good morning, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to appear in front of you. I'm a town girl. I'm not used to the city, but I'm a registered nurse, not a politician. But I ran for office because the community asked me to run for office, but I find myself with the arena is not easy. I'm not saying all the recommendation that the CFB been very supportive of me, and I've been communicating despite I did not get any money. I wish I had that money. But anyway, there's a few areas that I feel like it's a little, I should say a little unfair that I can be in front of the board to ask for fairness on that. I came many times, as a matter of fact, for seminars that CFB held in the past when I was running for office. So much as a registered nurse, I like to be tedious and on top of things. But unfortunately, toward the end, when you're really campaigning, there is no time for you to be monitoring every single step of the way of the filing. Unfortunately, I had the experience with this young man over here by the name of Theodore, which is not here. As we can see, none of my treasurer is here. But I'm forced to face something that I was, honestly, because I love to be honest, I know it's hard things in politics, but I was not involved step by step to the filing every day because I was on the street reaching to the people. It was a hard campaign. But I realized there was a slack of their parts. And one of the things I could not follow all the detail despite everything that I had done to respond because when CFB sending them, they're not responding to them. So having said that, failing to report a merchant account use, that's the first one. That account, from all the information I gathered, which I returned to CFB, is just like I didn't have much of, but one of them, there was no activity at all. And they left me with a bag of paper, which I took, days and months to try to figure out the best way I could respond to CFB, and I thank them for keeping up with me. One of the transaction, failing to report transaction, which I realized Mr. Theodore was not thorough before he gave it to, Lystra. And by the time the other treasurer took on, it was kind of hard. We were in the middle of a fiasco, I would say, of things that was going on in the community. If you never ran for office in that area, you would never know. But it was facing a lot of things, so a lot of challenges.
Let me stop you on that one, because I think of all the ones, is there any explanation? Because it's failing to report over $43,000 in transactions that appeared on the bank statements. That seems like an extraordinarily large amount of transactions not to have reported. Do you have any explanation for that?
That's the whole thing. I was talking to CFB, looking at all the paperwork, what I gathered. I just cannot understand the whole things, and I could not even open the file. But one thing I can tell you, like I said, politics is not easy, but I ran for campaign not to make money for myself. I ran for campaign because I want to represent the community, and everything that was raised, I was out there in the trail, raising the money. So in terms of that, I think it was just carelessness of a lot of things, because by the time I received those bags of papers, I see even a higher lawyer could not even put the things together. That's kind of something I could not understand, but that was not the money was spending in the campaign according to all the things that I tried to put together to respond to it. So that's the best I can tell you. But me personally, at work, that's what I was doing, reaching out to people. And I could not get all the detail, all the receipt. And one thing for sure, everything that's spent, it has to spend in the campaign. So those others that's what I had to replace one of the treasurer, as you probably can see, because when I realized they brought it to my attention that he was not doing the work. So by the time the next one came, she really worked day and night to put it together. So some of the receipt, I would say, is reported wrong because a lot of things apparently they did not get it together, and instead of working closely with CFB, they were trying to enter things and things not kicking in. And I recall somewhere along the way where they told me everything that was entered would disappear. So by the time I'm trying to get the Listra to come back to do it, she had her unfortunate situation with her own family, so she cannot come back to try it done. But one word that I remember gathered from her, she said, Mercedes, every single sin, everything that I have done is to make sure that you're elected, but unfortunately this climate is wrong. So that's what I got from the last campaign that left, the campaign manager that left. So she had entered them. For some reason, she said she could not track anything down, and she knew she came to do it. So that's something I'm not gonna even speculate because everybody got distressed over the whole campaign. So I don't know. I don't have that actual answer for that. But one thing I know from my part, raising from my grandmother, I did everything by the book. I pushed and I ran a campaign and I was out there. And I have a lot of people that came with their $10, with their $20 to support. But that's what it was. Even after the campaign, as we realized going down, I had to repay $10,000 to my boyfriend, which I agreed to do. And whatever I could have done, I have done myself personally. There is a merchant, there's one part, which I can't remember which one, corporation that's for 125 somewhere, that I received from a corporation, and which that corporation was a TV ad that was giving everybody interview here on accepting in-kind contribution from a corporation. That one was a surprise because she was interviewing everybody, but after I got interviewed, I got 125 fine for that too, which I find is not right, but who am I? And there's another one of the accepting contribution from unregistered political committees, which non-politician that gave me that money. I thought they were registered, and when I look back, they were not registered. So unfortunately, I sent the check back, but I still pay. I still have a fine on that too. The failing to demonstrate spending was in furtherance of the campaign. That one is Mr. Theodore. Somewhere along the line, I would said my whole campaign things was we were disappointed. There is no excuse for that because we did not receive money. We could not pay him, and apparently that's what took place. Which I worked closely with CFB and trying to get a letter from him. He gave a letter to explain his position and what happened because I could not even understand it myself. So when I went to him, they told me the best thing to talk to him and see what I can gather from him. He gave me a letter, and I returned that letter back to CFB as well. So, in terms of failing to respond to initial documentation, I spoke to the treasurer that replaced, which I said she worked day and night, and I have seen them working, and some of the information that was passed on to her, she was not able to put all of them together, which she spoke to CFB staff and explained, and it was too much, even for myself. After the whole process, it takes me a long time. Every night after work, I had to be in my office trying to do the best I can to provide the information, because I know myself personally what I have done is to try to represent the community, not to make money, because thank God I can work and I have done a good job even with my own children in the community. So it was not about that. It's about to serving the community. So I'm appearing in front of the board saying, after everybody gone, I believe I did the best I could under that climate to provide everything I could to show CFB that I was willing to provide the information. And that's where I faced you this morning to ask for leniency because that's all I could have done under the climate of everything that happened with that campaign. So that's where I am.
So can you explain, give us the date of Mr. Theodore's resignation as treasurer?
I cannot recall, but it was deep in the campaign, so it should have been somewhere around probably. No, I hate to give a number that I'm not so sure, but it was somewhere in probably February, March, somewhere, because I know by the time. No, probably May, because it was really hectic, and I had to make the decision when they approached me that he's not supposed to be the treasurer. When the campaign manager
I just wanted to clarify that Mr. Theodore was never actually.
He was not
actually
sorry.
acting as treasurer.
Sorry.
He was referred to several times as assistant treasurer, but he was only ever identified as a campaign liaison on the certification.
Thank you.
But
yes.
the treasurer did respond.
Listra.
The actual treasurer did resign in May of 2013.
Yes.
And was replaced. So, it's just to be absolutely clear.
So,
Can we address for a moment the implications in terms of the law and CFB rules that the loan from Mr. Charles was ultimately repaid, although that repayment apparently was on June 9th of 2017? So in other words, the loan was outstanding until less than 2 months ago. Are there any implications that it was ultimately repaid?
So the issue with the loan repayment was that in response to the renotice of the penalties that the candidate received, she issued a $10,000 refund to Mr. Charles, but used a personal check, which would normally constitute an in-kind contribution to the campaign from the candidate, which would have put her over the limit. In this case, given the candidate's attempts to comply with CFB instructions and that she was only attempting to resolve an outstanding issue, we chose to only recommend the prior penalty amount rather than revising our penalty estimates.
It would have been higher.
Which would have been substantially higher.
So a loan that's outstanding on the date of the election is considered a contribution from that person. But generally, if it's repaid, we give a break. But in this case, it was repaid by making another contribution that was over the limit, and so we decided to just go with the lower, keep the lower violation of penalty.
Anything further from CFB staff?
No, that's it.
Anything further from you, Ms. Narcisse?
I'm just hoping for the best for leniency for this because I did everything I could have done under the climate.
I do have one final question. Just looking through the undocumented expenditures and the dates of the treasurer resignation and the assistant and the campaign liaison resignation, it appears that those resignations happened before many of these undocumented transactions actually occurred. And so I'm curious as to, given the turmoil that you described in your treasurer function, what happened with the subsequent treasurer where these transactions were not documented?
You're talking about the one after he was gone?
You're referring to May of 2013 is when your treasurer resigned. Is that correct?
Yeah, but he transferred. Technically, practically talking, it's not funny, but the bag of information, not in a black bag, just throw things, and it was a chaos at that time. So they had to take time to go over everything to try to document things.
So the dates of these transactions on the transaction report, expenditure sample report, are in some respects backdated, or are they actually the dates of the transactions themselves?
They're the dates that are reported by the campaign.
I see. So
Because we don't
those-
have the documentation,
so
we don't
those could have
actually know
been-
the answer to that question.
I see. So those could have been prior expenditures, but you have no documentation to see otherwise. Okay.
It was pretty much chaos. Yes.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take it
Thank
under
you very much.
consideration.
Thank you.
Now, there are two candidates who are not appearing today, but with respect to one of them, the board wishes to discuss some issues in open session. That candidate is William Thompson. I have recused myself from participating in any of the deliberations relating to this matter, and so I'm going to leave the boardroom at this time, and Mr. Davis will chair the meeting on this matter.
Okay, but before the chair leaves, let me just give for the public record the announcement of the issues that the board is considering for the other campaign, which is the campaign of Mark Weprin for City Council in 2013, District 23, accepting over-the-limit contributions from two contributors doing business with the city, accepting a contribution from a limited liability company, failure to properly report intermediaries, making a cash expenditure greater than $100, and late response to the initial documentation requests. So the board will be considering those. So now,
Thank you.
Okay.
as
So why don't we move to Ms. Thompson, and we're going to ask the executive director to sort of review that little bit of the history related to this matter before we start asking a few questions.
So, sorry. So first, for the record, I'd like to just enumerate the timeline related to the Thompson campaign. He was a candidate for mayor in 2013. On November 26, 2013, the CFB staff sent an initial document request. On December 26, 2013, an extension was granted to January 10th, 2014. On January 16th, 2014, a notice that no response had been received was sent. On January 17th, the response was received. On February 3rd, an inadequate notice was sent to the campaign with a deadline to respond of March 5th. On March 12th, 2014, a no response notice was sent. On March 20th, a response was received. On March 21st, an inadequate response notice was sent with a deadline to respond of April 21st, 2014. On April 25th, a no response notice was sent. On May 2nd, an extension was granted to May 15th. On May 15th, an extension was granted to May 29th. On May 30th, the response to the initial document request was received. On March 9th, 2015, the draft audit report was sent with a deadline to respond of April 8th. On April 3rd, 2015, an extension was granted to May 11th. On May 8th, an extension was granted to May 26th. On May 20th, an extension was granted to June 10th. On June 9th, an extension was granted to June 25th. On June 29th, an extension was granted to July 9th. I will note that neither of those extension letters were opened in C-Access, which is the form by which we send these extension letters. On July 8th, 2015, an extension was granted to July 23rd. On July 23rd, a final extension was granted to August 6th. And on August 10th, 2015, a response was received to the draft audit report. On March 3rd, 2016, a notice of alleged violations and public funds notice was sent with a deadline to respond of April 14th, 2016. On April 5th, an extension was granted to April 28th. On April 21st, an extension was granted to May 26th. On May 25th, an extension was granted to June 27th. On June 23rd, an extension was granted to July 27th. On July 25th, an extension was granted to 8/26. On August 26th, final extension was granted to September 26th. On September 26th, 2016, a response was received to the penalty notice. On January 23rd, 2017, the campaign was notified of the results of the staff's analysis of that response. On February 15th, 2017, the campaign indicated that it would like to appear before the board. It was given the choice of either appearing at the March 9th or April 13th board meeting, but requests instead the May 11th meeting. On May 8th, that appearance was rescheduled to June 15th at the campaign's request. On June 13th, 2017, the appearance was rescheduled to July 13th. That extension request was at the CFB's request. On July 10th, the appearance was rescheduled to July 27th, meeting at the campaign's request. And on July 24th, the campaign made its first request to submit additional documentation. Then yesterday at 5:47 p.m., the staff attorney received an email from the campaign with asking for explaining why he sent this late documentation. I'm going to read this email into the record and the response of the staff attorney. Bethany, my sincere apologies for the late nature of this email. It has been extremely challenging throughout the post-election audit to compile the documentation necessary to respond appropriately to the CFB. As you may know, the custodian of the committee's record, Monique Renaud, is the caretaker of a special needs child and works part-time from her home. Monique's family obligations and work obligations have prevented her from more fully focusing on this post-election audit, which in turn has limited my ability to produce for you the documentation necessary to demonstrate the committee's good faith attempts at compliance with the Campaign Finance Act. I recognize and appreciate that you have been generous in consenting to multiple postponements of this matter, and I am now in the position to once again respectfully request that you grant one final extension of time. I would hate for the candidate to be penalized in both reputational and financial terms for campaign staff inability to produce necessary records to demonstrate the committee's compliance. I have attached a partial response to the final recommendation, which I believe shows significant efforts to respond to and cure major issues identified in the recommendation. In the event that you are unable to agree to a postponement, out of respect for the board members' time, the campaign will not appear tomorrow morning, and please accept the attached response for consideration by the board. Sincerely, Vito Pita, member of Pitta, Bishop, and Del Giorno. Ms. Persky, Bethany Persky, the staff attorney, responded again last night. Vito, I'm sorry to hear of the difficulties faced by the campaign, but unfortunately we are still not in a position to grant another extension. It will not be possible for an auditor to review this documentation in time to change the staff recommendation for tomorrow, but staff will inform the board that the documentation was submitted and they may choose to review it at their discretion. Thank you, Bethany. I want to point out for the board that there is CFB Rule 7-02C2 states that unless specifically notified to the contrary by the board, the opportunity to submit information and documentation described in the notice shall be the only such opportunity, and any information and documentation that is not timely received by the board may, at the board's sole discretion, be disregarded. So the issues before the board this morning for consideration are as follows. Failing to provide bank statements, failing to report transactions, filing a late disclosure statement, failing to demonstrate compliance with subcontractor reporting and documentation requirements, failing to disclose political committees used in furtherance of the campaign, accepting over-the-limit contributions, accepting contributions from corporations, limited liability companies, or partnerships, failing to document transactions, failing to demonstrate compliance with intermediary reporting and documentation requirements, failing to demonstrate that spending was in furtherance of the campaign, making impermissible post-election expenditures, exceeding the expenditure limit, and commingling campaign funds with funds accepted for a different election. As you can see, the staff is available to answer any questions that the board may have.
Yes, I should say that, what the board has decided to do is to proceed in light of this history. We will hear from the staff in terms of response to questions. We will then deliberate And then in the course of that deliberation, we will decide whether there is any need for any, to allow any further time for the campaign. So in terms of, before I go, questions that you may have?
Well, I'd like to focus your attention, if I may, on the possibility that some of these penalties may relate to related violations. So to what extent are some of these proposed penalties duplicative of one another? And focusing in particular on the largest of the three. But any of the penalties that, in your mind, might relate to related violations.
Not that I can see. If you're referring to the fact that certain in-kind contributions are also included in the expenditure limit calculation, that wouldn't really affect any of the penalties included in the documentation submitted by the campaign. The only two.
But let me follow up. I mean, but if you're being penalized for an in-kind contribution, and then the same facts are being used to establish that's over the limit, I think that's the kind of duplication we're talking about. It's the same facts, and we're penalizing. Well, yes, they're separate violations, but it's the same act is causing two separate penalty amounts.
Yes. Well, first of all, I think only in this case, the Higgins contract would be the only of these listed that would reflect, because in the case of the corporate contributions, what the campaign has provided is checks to indicate that these outstanding amounts were paid. So that just makes them expenditures. It would reduce or possibly eliminate the penalty for
I'm
the
not talking about what the
contribution.
documents produced.
Okay.
We're just talking about what duplication exists within the notice of penalties.
I can speak, I suppose, generally to the idea that the same underlying conduct could be penalized as an over-the-limit contribution and also as part of an expenditure limit penalty. And the contribution limits and the expenditure limits exist for two different purposes. They are separate. The contribution limits prevent against undue influence being exerted against or on a candidate or an elected official. The expenditure limits are there to prevent an unfair advantage being gained by one candidate over one of his or her opponents. And so they do serve two different purposes. There are two different rationales. There are also different limits. So a particular transaction could be a contribution limit, but if the campaign hasn't otherwise spent enough to be over the spending limit, then it wouldn't factor in that case, and vice versa.
So just to be clear, plenty of campaigns have over the course of time have had penalties for over the limit in-kind contributions or failing to document in-kind contributions, and those have been included in the calculation of their compliance with the spending limit. Yeah.
I understand, but the point I'm trying to establish, and I just want to be clear, is that when we say that somebody didn't get paid the amount of the contract, and therefore there was an in-kind contribution, we then, how does that relate? I mean, some of these things then translate into over-the-limit contributions. I mean, I'm just confused because my understanding is that there is a fair amount of duplication in some of these larger penalties.
Well, the board rules provide that an in-kind contribution by definition is both a contribution to and an expenditure by the campaign. The word "and" also is in the text of the rule. It's fairly clear this is supposed to be treated both as a contribution and as an expenditure. They're there to address two different problems.
I understand they're there to address two different problems, but we're trying to establish whether the same conduct is causing two separate penalties.
It's the
Forget
same
about whether there's different rules have different policies. In what of these penalties is the same conduct causing two separate penalties to be imposed?
I guess you could say yes. I mean, in the case of the expenditure limit calculation, it's not so much penalizing the underlying conduct as it is that conduct is designated an expenditure by law, and therefore it is included in a calculation that then, if the campaign is over, results in the penalty. If the campaign stays within the expenditure limit, there's no penalty for that conduct.
Mm-hmm. So, but you're talking about specific transactions that are listed both as in other violations, but that are also contributing to the amount that the candidate is over the spending limit. There are several of those because there is, if you look at the expenditure limit calculation, there's $39,000 in in-kind contributions that are being added that had not been reported. Had they been reported as in-kind contributions, they would have been included in the expenditure limit calculation as a matter of course. And those amounts are listed on exhibit, I'm trying to read Roman numerals, sorry, 19C.
So which violation? So those are
Those are unreported in-kind contributions. Some of them are also over the limit, contributions.
Right, unreported transactions are another example of if an expenditure is not reported, it's penalized for being unreported, but it's also included in the expenditure limit calculation because the fact that it was not reported doesn't change the fact that it was an expenditure made by the campaign in furtherance of the campaign got the benefit of that
I
expenditure.
understand, but do we have a number as to how much would fit in this category where the unreported in-kinds were translated into the penalty for being over the limit? Is that the 39,000 you just referred to?
I believe so, on
Well,
exhibit
I have
19C.
19C. So just to rephrase, I think Rich's question, is this $40,074.29? Does that total amount also trigger the over the limit contribution violation?
Not the amount itself. Each of these, or several of these, are also cited as over the limit contributions individually.
But not all of them.
No. Well, some of them are corporate, some of them are over the limit.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to go on this topic? I have some other questions, or do you have other questions, or you want to ask?
I just wanted to quickly ask, is there any overlap between violation 6 and violation 7? I don't think so. But
No, that's okay. One thing that our penalty guidelines provide. If something is both over the limit and corporate, it's penalized just as corporate.
Thank you.
While Mr. Chang is checking, let me ask a question. In terms of, the penalty amount isn't very large, but you have this Betsy Gottbaum under violation number 2. Betsy Gottbaum was reported as both the advancer and the vendor. What is it that we didn't know as a matter of disclosure about that event? Didn't we know that Betsy Gottbaum got the money?
Right, but we don't know who she paid it to, who the ultimate expenditure was made to. So when a campaign reports in advance, presumably what they're doing is giving someone money, and then that person makes an expenditure on behalf of the campaign.
But
so
she's also the vendor.
Right, that's a reporting issue. They listed her as both the vendor. If it's listed as an advance, that means that the advancer is not the same as the vendor. In order to get full disclosure, we need both. We need to see where the money ended up.
But that suggests the money ended up with her because she's listed
as the vendor. Well, then in that case, it's not an advance.
What?
They just paid her. I mean, if you just paid Betsy Gottbaum money, that you would just report it as an expenditure.
I understand. Okay. Now, in terms of Westwind, payment to Salem Westwind.
Yes.
Is there a record that he went actually on the payroll in July?
Yeah.
I mean, my understanding is that the campaign report is starting paying him wages in July. Wouldn't that be an indicator that he did switch to being on the payroll in July?
Yes, he was. He was switched over in July.
He was on the payroll.
Right.
Violation number 3. We have a penalty for disclosing statement is 8 days late. And am I right that the sole cause of lateness was not including documentation for one contribution?
Yeah, the rules provide that unless all of the backup documentation is submitted, that the disclosure statement has not been fully submitted at that point.
And then violation 4, Hudson Hotel. Is there a presumption that the burden is on the campaign to prove that there were no subcontractors used by this vendor?
The campaign simply has to inquire of the vendor and show us that they did. They could send an email to the vendor and send us a copy of that email. Just the inquiry would be sufficient, but they did not do that.
This is a venue for an event, as I would think. why would we automatically, I mean, it's conceivable that there might be subcontractors, but why would we think that there automatically would be subcontractors if you go to the Waldorf and you say, I'm going to have an event at the Waldorf, I'm going to pay them X dollars? Why would you assume that they're subcontractors?
It's just based on the amount under the law. I mean, they could have brought in a caterer or a band, we don't know. And when an expenditure is of this amount, we require a campaign at least to ask the vendor if they used a subcontractor. Even if the vendor doesn't respond, all the campaign has to do is show that they asked.
This is any and all vendors?
Yes.
Over what?
Over $5,000.
Okay, thank you.
There was, in the contribution, this is violation, I guess, 6, about Cattell, where they say that it was refunded, and they say it's reflected in the bank statement. What is it is or it isn't in the bank statement? What is
We
the bank
don't have
statement?
the canceled check. We can't see who cashed the check.
But there's a line item on the bank statement?
So the check came out of the account, the money came out of the account. We
Yep.
just don't know for sure that the contributor is the one who cashed it until we see the canceled check. That's policy.
Well, do we know that do we have any information that it was actually, the check was made out to him?
Do we have the front of the check? We do not.
We just see in a transaction for that amount on that date.
In violation number 7, under David Eisen, corporate contributions that were not refunded. What do we know that he's a corporation? I mean, this.
Attorney at law. I assume you looked him up in the database, right?
Right, this is listed in the New York State corporate database.
When we say, so he's David Eisen LLC or LLP? His law,
Either way, I don't have that information.
single practitioner lawyers would often be LLPs. I mean, they would very rarely be LLCs.
Well, partnerships are covered as well.
But you're saying he's in the corporate, as an attorney, he's in the corporate database?
Yes.
Well, is there some reason to know that he gave this in his personal capacity or in his corporate capacity?
So David M. Eisen, attorney at law, is based on the way it was reported by the campaign. That attorney at law that language was reported as the contributor name. So that's what we have to go by.
Do we have the check? Do we know whether the check came from a personal account or a corporate account?
Well, not the 270. It was. Well, this one's ABC, so that should be a check. So, well, the $272 transaction appears to have been an uncleared. That's an outstanding liability. For the first one, we should have the check, right?
Right, we should have a check, yes.
You don't have it available? Okay. We don't have it on us, but we do have it. And presumably, if there were something on the check to indicate that it were not from a corporate account, we would not have cited it.
Also, in this kind of case, I mean, what we ask candidates to do, I mean, often candidates submit checks that are, they actually reported it this way, but often candidates report the check as an individual or, with just the name. The fact that they reported it as attorney at law indicates to me that they reported it as an organization, but they also could get what we tell people to do is to get an affidavit to say that it actually is from their personal account. So that, there's a way to fix this, if, to demonstrate that it is not actually from a corporation.
Right. That instruction would have been in the DAR and in the penalty notice as well.
And it's clear these are contributions as opposed to services.
They're reported that way. as contributions.
The 2,500.
They're the two,
And
the
the-
25 and the 2175, not the 272. It's
Right. That I believe was an uncleared transaction, so an outstanding liability that was not paid.
In terms of the Willis Group, we say they only reported 4 of the 6 payments. Do we know whether the other 2 payments were entered into C-Smart?
I believe that they entered 2 of those payments into C-Smart and just did not provide any documentation of the payment. So we don't have a check or a bank statement or anything showing that the payment was actually made.
When you say we don't have a bank statement, you mean we haven't reconciled it to a bank statement?
Any of the bank statements that we have, which go up until April 2014, aside from the ones that were cited as missing, none of those show this payment coming out of their account.
Well, let me ask, have you actually looked for checks on the amount of the reported dates that they provided to go back to the bank statements to see if there are entries in those amounts on those dates?
Yes.
And you didn't find them?
Right.
Do you have a question on finding number 8? Unless you have something before that. On finding number 8, there's a penalty of $400 for Horton, Lappin, Sampson, and Cologne transactions.
Yes.
And the campaign's response is that they had provided documentation of its attempts to obtain documentation. How does that typically get reported to you?
Wait, I'm sorry, how does which get reported? Its efforts to contact
document,
the...
right? Efforts to document, the efforts to obtain documentation from.
That would usually be emails in this case. Do you remember if that's what it was? It usually a campaign can send us copies of emails that it sent that were not
And
returned.
those emails go to the candidate liaison or to the audit staff?
It would be, for this would have been the penalty notice response, so that comes to us. They don't forward the email, they just, print it out as part of their,
I see.
as an exhibit to their response.
Are there any other questions?
Don't.
So why don't we move into our deliberations?
I don't know where the chair went. Hillary.
Okay, we're back in public session, and I'm going to go through each of the candidates. Well, I'll go through one at a time with respect to penalties and repayments, and we'll vote on each one as we go along. So the first is the candidate Joseph Hayan, and these are the recommended violations and penalties on which we will vote when I finish stating them. Failing to report transactions, $99. Failing to demonstrate compliance with reporting requirements for disbursements, $500. Filing a late disclosure statement, $50. Accepting contributions from corporations, $1,350, and that penalty is not to be assessed against the treasurer. Failing to document a transaction, violation, no penalty. Failing to demonstrate that spending was in furtherance of the campaign, $977. Failing to respond to the initial documentation request and filing a late response to the draft audit report, $2,810, and that amount is not to be assessed against the treasurer. Do I have a motion to confirm that?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries. I'm going to do Thompson last. Next, the candidate is Mark Weprin, and the recommended violations and penalties are as follows. Accepting over-the-limit contributions from 2 contributors doing business with the city, $250. I'm sorry, before I do that, I need to back up. With respect to Hayan, I just want to make clear that the total penalties, just give the total that we just voted on, is $5,786, and there is also a recommended public funds repayment of $19,859. I'm going to redo our motion with that included. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? So that motion carries. Okay, on to Mark Weprin. Let me start it again. Accepting over the limit contribution from 2 contributors doing business with the city, $250. Accepting a contribution from a limited liability company, $125. Failing to demonstrate compliance with intermediary reporting and documentation requirements, $100. Making a cash expenditure greater than $100, $50. Late response to the initial documentation request, $471. Total penalties of $996, and there's no public funds repayment. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? That carries. Next, Mercedes Narcisse is the candidate, and these are the recommended penalties, violations and penalties. Failing to report a merchant account used for campaign purposes, $50. Failing to provide bank statements, $500. Failing to report transactions, $872. Failing to demonstrate compliance with cash receipts reporting and documentation requirements, $960. Failing to demonstrate compliance with reporting requirements for disbursements, violation but no penalty. Filing late disclosure statements, $875. Accepting over the limit contributions, $1,650. Accepting an in-kind contribution from a corporation, $125. Accepting contributions from unregistered political committees, $250. Failing to document basic campaign functions, $500. Failing to document transactions, $300. failing to demonstrate compliance with intermediary reporting and documentation requirements, $200, failing to demonstrate that spending was in furtherance of the campaign, $2,549, failing to respond to initial documentation request and audit request, $2,166, for total penalties of $10,997. Recommended public funds payment, $1,648, and therefore a total repayment requirement of $9,349. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries. And Mr. Davis?
In terms of the Thompson campaign, in light of the size of the penalties, the board has decided that this matter will be heard next Thursday on August 1st. The campaign should be notified that it will go forward on that date. We will make a decision on that date, and they are invited to attend. And if they don't attend, then we will proceed in any event.
August 3rd.
August 3rd.
Wait, August 3rd.
August 3rd is, you said August 1st, but.
I'm sorry, August 3rd. August 3rd, Thursday.
There being no further business.
Wait, there's.
Oh, there is. Sorry, there is one further piece of business, and that is there has been filed a petition for extraordinary circumstances. Do you want to describe the petition?
A petition for the board to determine that there's extraordinary circumstances to extend the deadline to file certification in Council District 28 following the conviction and removal from office of former council member Reuben Wills. A petition has been filed, and the staff is recommending that the board accept that petition, grant that petition.
I move that we grant the petition.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? The petition is granted. And with that, I'll make a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second, and all those in favor? Aye. We stand adjourned. Thank you very much.